The old wooden bench stood at the edge of the park's walking path, worn and forgotten like so many of the things left behind in this overlooked part of the city. But what drew attention that day wasn't the bench itself, but the creature resting on it. An old, frail dog with a coat that had once been golden but now was a patchy, grayed reminder of better days. His ribs showed through his fur, each breath shallow and uneven, his head bowed as if heavy with years, sorrow, or both. People passed by, joggers, mothers with strollers, businessmen on quick calls, and every single one of them turned their eyes away. They saw a stray, maybe sick, maybe dying, but none stopped. No one asked how he got there, or why he hadn't moved. To the world, he was invisible. But to the girl watching from a distance, the one whose shoes barely held together, whose hair hadn't been combed in days, and whose arms carried a small plastic bag full of collected cans, he wasn't invisible. He was the only still thing in a world that never stopped moving. Her name was Ellie, and she had grown up knowing what it felt like to be walked past, ignored, mistaken for someone not worth stopping for. Maybe that's why, when she first noticed the dog wasn't just resting but trembling and holding something beneath his paw, she couldn't keep walking. Ellie had never planned to be in this part of town. Her usual scavenging routes didn't reach this far into the Central Park area, but today something had guided her steps differently. Maybe it was hunger, maybe the aching cold, or maybe the quiet thought that something might change if she didn't do exactly the same thing as every other day. The girl's legs ached from walking, and her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. But when she saw the dog, all of that faded into background noise. There was something solemn about the way he remained motionless, not in sleep or comfort, but in resignation. She inched closer with the kind of caution learned by someone who's been bitten by both people and life too many times. Strays usually ran, barked, or growled, but this dog did none of that. He simply lifted his gaze and looked at her with such depth and silence that Ellie felt a strange sense of permission, almost as if he had been waiting. The closer she got, the more details unfolded. The collar, cracked and worn, had once been leather but now was brittle from age. The metal buckle barely clung together, and there was no name tag, just a small rusted loop where one may have hung. His fur was matted, particularly around his legs and belly, and under his front paw, something was sticking out. A piece of folded paper, yellowed at the edges, damp from morning dew or maybe even the dog's own breath. Ellie's hands hesitated. It felt too important to just grab it. So she knelt, slowly, pressing her knees to the cold ground, and rested her hand beside his paw. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a breath. Long, shaky, but calm, as if the arrival of this little girl had been what he was holding on for. She gently pulled the paper from under his paw. The corner was torn, the ink faint in places, but it was unmistakably a letter. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it, not because of the cold but because something deep inside her, something quiet and instinctive, told her that this letter was not meant to be ignored. As she read the first lines, her brow furrowed. The handwriting was shaky, almost like someone had written it in pain or with trembling hands. She couldn't make out all of it right away, but the words she could decipher felt heavy. Words like sorry, please, couldn't keep him, love, and final chance. Each word felt like it carried more than ink, it carried guilt, sorrow, desperation, and something like hope wrapped in a final goodbye. Ellie sat down beside the bench, unaware of how long she'd been kneeling. Her legs had gone numb, but she didn't move. She read and reread the letter, piecing together what she could. It spoke of a woman who had lost everything, her family, her health, her home, but not her dog. The letter told how she had fed him when she went hungry, how he had comforted her when the world went cold. But now, she couldn't go on. She had left him there because he had once loved this park, once barked with joy chasing squirrels along its hedges. She hoped, prayed even, that someone would find him, someone who still believed in kindness. Ellie pressed the paper to her chest and looked at the dog again. He hadn't moved much, but his eyes hadn't left her face. There was no fear in them, no urgency, just that same quiet question she had seen in so many mirrors. Do I still matter? She didn't have an answer, but she knew this. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not ever. The girl who had grown up invisible had just been trusted with a final message from a stranger, and maybe, just maybe, this moment was the beginning of something neither of them had ever been given before, a reason to be seen. The cold crept in slowly that evening, the kind that didn't bite at once but settled deep in the bones and made everything feel heavier. Ellie stayed beside the dog, her small frame curled next to the bench where he lay unmoving. The letter she had found still rested gently on her lap, smoothed out now, as though doing so could somehow flatten the creases time and sorrow had pressed into it. The park emptied as the sun dipped low, shadows growing long, but Ellie didn't flinch. The world could forget this place, this animal, and her too, but she wouldn't forget him. Not tonight. Not now. The silence between them was profound, like two souls that didn't need words to know they shared the same kind of ache. She didn't know how long he had waited there before she came. Days maybe. Long enough for others to ignore him. Long enough for hope to feel like fiction. But now he wasn't alone, and that meant something. At least to her. She had nowhere to go. The shelter where she sometimes found a cot was already full that week. The church soup kitchen had closed early. The city had long since stopped noticing the invisible. But even so, sitting beside this dying creature gave her a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She whispered softly to herself, not out of madness, but to fill the air with something gentle. And though the dog could barely move, his eyes would twitch at the sound of her voice. There was life still clinging, even if faint, and Ellie wasn't going to let it fade in silence. She remembered things her grandmother used to tell her before she passed, about how animals knew hearts better than people did. That dogs could sense the pure ones. Ellie never believed she had anything pure left in her, but maybe the dog saw something she didn't. Maybe this moment wasn't about what either of them had lost, but about what they could still give. When night finally took hold and the park lamps flickered to life, Ellie looked up and realized hours had gone by. Her body ached, her fingers were stiff, but she couldn't leave. The dog hadn't moved from his position, but his breathing was steady, shallow, but steady. She noticed now the way his chest would rise only slightly before falling again. The kind of breath that belonged to someone holding on. She pulled from her tattered backpack the only thing she had of value, a small scarf her mother had knitted long ago. It was worn thin and unraveling at the edges, but it still carried warmth. She wrapped it around the dog carefully, tucking it beneath his chin like a blanket. The dog didn't resist. He let out a faint exhale, like a sigh that said thank you in its own way. She had seen people in worse states, humans who had given up long before their time. But this animal, despite everything, was still waiting for something. She didn't know what it was, but maybe, just maybe, she could help him find it. The following morning came with a chill in the air and a thin mist crawling across the park paths. Ellie had drifted in and out of sleep beside the bench, one arm over the dog like a protective wing. She awoke to faint sounds, footsteps, voices in the distance, but the city always started before she was ready. She blinked hard, shook the cold from her bones, and checked on the dog. He was still breathing, slower now, like a clock winding down. But his paw had shifted slightly in the night, revealing something else she hadn't noticed before. A second slip of paper, smaller than the first, folded tightly and tied with a piece of old thread around his collar's base. Her fingers trembled as she untied it. This one was shorter, written in the same handwriting, but more desperate. It read simply, "If you found him, you're kind. Please don't let him die alone. He saved me once. I couldn't repay him. Maybe you can." That was all it said. No name. No contact. Just a quiet plea carved from the last of someone's hope. Ellie folded it gently and tucked it inside the first letter, now pressed against her chest. She didn't cry. Not yet. But the weight of those words clung to her. She sat upright, looked around, and knew she had to do something. Waiting beside the bench wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about bearing witness anymore. This was a call to action, and she couldn't ignore it. Her first thought was the vet clinic she had passed weeks ago, on the edge of the neighborhood she avoided. It had looked expensive, far beyond her reach, but it had clean windows, warm lights, and the kind of smell that told her animals inside were treated like family. But it was miles away, and she had no money, no phone, no transportation. Just willpower and a fragile scarf wrapped around a dog who barely had the strength to lift his head. She slid her arms under his thin frame, her knees shaking as she tried to lift him. He wasn't heavy, but every movement he made felt like it drained what little life he had left. Still, she managed. Cradling him like a child, she began walking. With every step, Ellie whispered quiet words to him, telling him to hold on, that he mattered, that someone cared. The streets she passed were indifferent, cars rushing, people avoiding eye contact, shops opening for business like it was any other day. And maybe for them it was. But for her, this was a pilgrimage. Every block, every crack in the sidewalk, every exhaust fume, they all became part of the journey. Her arms burned, her legs threatened to give out, but she kept moving. The dog's head rested against her chest now, his breath warm against her collarbone, and she could feel the slowing rhythm like a ticking clock nearing its final second. She didn't know what would happen when she arrived. She didn't know if the clinic would help, or if they'd turn her away like so many others had. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the promise she had made, silent but real, when she read those letters and sat beside that bench. She had been chosen, maybe not in words, but in something deeper. She had been the one to stop, the one to see, and now, the only one who could try to change this story before it ended. The vet clinic stood like a foreign palace at the end of her journey, white walls gleaming under the gray morning light, glass doors pristine, a warm halo of orange lamplight spilling onto the pavement from within. Ellie's feet ached from the walk, her arms trembling beneath the weight of the dog pressed tightly against her chest. She had lost count of how many blocks she had walked, how many traffic lights she had waited to cross with people staring at her and then looking away. The world had never felt so distant, yet she had never been more determined. Her knees nearly buckled as she stepped onto the clean tiles just inside the entrance. The contrast between her worn sneakers soaked with dew and the polished floor struck her all at once. She didn't belong there. Not her with her thrift store coat, ragged scarf, hair knotted by wind and worry, and yet she had come anyway, because someone had to. Behind the desk sat a woman in a pale blue uniform, mid-40s maybe, professional and poised, her hands poised over a keyboard. She looked up, startled by Ellie's appearance. Not out of malice, but confusion, as though unsure whether she was witnessing a child or a shadow from outside. Ellie didn't speak. Her voice had grown brittle during the walk. Instead, she stepped forward, lowered herself slowly to her knees, and placed the dog down as gently as she could onto the mat just in front of the reception. His body remained limp, but he opened his eyes faintly, just long enough for the woman to notice the slow blink, the shallow rise and fall of his ribs. That was enough. Without a word, the woman stood and disappeared behind a door. Seconds later, a young man in scrubs burst through, crouched next to the dog, and lifted him carefully into his arms, calling for a gurney. No one asked questions. Not yet. They just moved. Ellie remained on the floor, too tired to stand, her breathing sharp and uneven. Her hands were red from the cold, nails broken from clutching the dog's weight, but she didn't feel any of that. Her eyes remained fixed on the door where they had taken him, hoping, praying, begging in silence. When the receptionist returned, she sat beside her, not behind the desk, but right there on the tile. She didn't ask who Ellie was. Instead, she offered her a paper cup of warm water. Ellie took it, her hands shaking as she drank, feeling the heat travel down her throat like something holy. It was the first kindness she had received in weeks without an exchange or condition. She closed her eyes and let it settle. Minutes turned into hours. The waiting room emptied and refilled. Rain began to fall outside in quiet streaks against the windows. Ellie didn't move from her seat, afraid that leaving would unravel everything she had fought for. She didn't even realize she was still holding the folded letters in her pocket until the receptionist gently tapped her arm and asked if she had anything the vets should know about the animal. Ellie hesitated, then passed the notes over. The woman took them, read the first line, and something in her posture changed. She didn't ask anything else. She only nodded, then disappeared again into the hallway, letters in hand. Behind closed doors, the dog's body lay motionless on a steel table, surrounded by soft lighting and silent professionals. The vet, a man in his 60s with eyes that had seen too many endings, moved slowly but precisely. He pressed gently along the dog's abdomen, listened to his heart, checked his gums, and whispered updates to the nurse beside him. They found signs of extreme fatigue, minor infections, and deep hunger, but nothing that couldn't be treated. He had survived worse, they guessed. Something in his body still clung to life. But it wasn't the condition that shook the vet. It was the letter, read aloud in that sterile room, each word pulling silence tighter around them. The dog wasn't just another stray. He had meaning. He had history. And now, because of a girl with no home and no voice, he had another chance. Back in the lobby, Ellie remained motionless. The clinic had given her a blanket to warm herself, a small sandwich she hadn't touched, and a promise that they were doing their best. But even with those comforts, she felt like she was floating between two worlds, one where she had found the dog and chosen to stop, and another where she might have to let go. Her thoughts wandered to the letter again, to the words about the dog having once saved someone. She wondered what that story was, who the man was, where he had gone, what had kept him from coming back. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe his part of the journey had ended, and hers had begun. The door behind the desk clicked open again, and the vet stepped out. He didn't wear the same stiff expression of most doctors Ellie had seen. Instead, his face looked tired, but soft, like someone carrying more than facts. He sat beside her and spoke gently, telling her the dog was stable, that it would take days to fully recover, but he had survived the worst. Then he added something else, that they had decided to waive the treatment costs. That the story in the letter, and what Ellie had done, was enough. That sometimes, the right thing didn't need paperwork. Ellie stared at him, stunned. She nodded once, then let her head fall into her hands, breath catching in her throat, not quite crying, but somewhere close. That night, they let her sleep on a cot in the back room. She lay wrapped in a donated blanket, her eyes on the ceiling tiles as rain tapped gently on the roof. The dog slept 2 doors away, monitored by machines and kind hands. For the first time in months, Ellie slept without fear of being asked to move. Without having to look over her shoulder. She dreamt of benches and letters and dogs who waited. And when she woke, something in her chest felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, but whole. This wasn't over. She knew that. There was still a message to understand. A purpose buried beneath fur and silence. But for now, there was rest. And for the first time in far too long, there was hope. The morning after the discovery of the folded note, Sophia's world had changed. The girl who once walked the streets with downcast eyes and hurried steps now carried something deeper, an unspoken duty, a gravity that made each breath feel heavier and each hour more sacred. She could not shake the image of the dog sitting frozen on the bench, nor the scrawl of words that seemed etched not only on paper but into her memory. The message haunted her gently, like a song you don't want to forget, and as the hours passed, the weight of it grew. She found herself waking before dawn, slipping out of the shelter quietly, as though she were afraid someone would stop her. The dog, still weak but breathing, had not moved far from where she first found him. He was now lying under a canopy of brittle leaves in a park that only the forgotten visited. Sophia sat beside him, letting the cold morning seep into her bones, feeling oddly comforted by the silence that surrounded them. There was something sacred in that hush, something she hadn't felt in years, like someone was finally listening. She began reading the note again and again. It wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the way they were written, the uneven strokes, the fading ink in some letters, the hesitant pressure on certain parts of the page. It was clear that whoever wrote it did so with trembling hands. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a confession. A plea wrapped in ink and paper. The words spoke of regret, of a life lived for the wrong reasons, and a desperate hope that someone kind enough might take care of what he couldn't anymore. The message didn't ask for money or forgiveness. It asked only for humanity. For someone, anyone, to see value in what was left behind. A dying dog, abandoned not by accident but by a man who could no longer bear his own failures. Sophia began to understand this wasn't just a dog someone had left behind. It was a final attempt at redemption, A silent gesture made by someone who had run out of words, time, and love. The man hadn't just left a dog on a bench. He had left the last thread of his conscience there, hoping that someone better would find it. Sophia felt something awaken in her. For the first time since her mother's passing and the years of silence that followed, she felt she was holding something that mattered. She returned every day to care for the dog, who she now called Benny, not because she was obligated, but because it became clear he was more than a symbol. He was a bridge between two broken souls, the one who left him and the one who found him. Benny's eyes began to clear slowly. He no longer shivered in fear when she reached out to him. He no longer whined in his sleep. Sophia's presence had become his safe place. She started feeding him small portions, wrapping him in the only blanket she had, and talking softly to him as though trying to heal him through words. As she did, she began speaking more, about her past, her regrets, her longing to be something more than just a face in the crowd. It was as if Benny absorbed all that pain without judgment, returning it only with a slow wag of his tail or the way he pressed his face into her knee. She didn't know who the man from the letter was or why he had to let Benny go. But she knew the burden he left behind wasn't too heavy for her. In fact, it gave her a reason to keep going. One afternoon, while searching for a safe place to shelter from an approaching storm, Sophia walked to a closed shop at the edge of the neighborhood and noticed an elderly woman watching her. The woman had seen Sophia with the dog for days and finally approached. Her eyes were cautious, not unkind, and her voice quivered with both age and unspoken sorrow. She asked Sophia about Benny, and as Sophia explained, carefully, respectfully, the woman's face tightened in shock. The description of the note made her raise her hand to her mouth. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it before. The man who wrote that note, she whispered, was her son. A son who had disappeared after losing everything, his family, his job, and his will to live. She hadn't heard from him in years and had feared the worst. Sophia's heart raced. The story she had stumbled into was larger than she imagined. The dog wasn't just a final message, he was the missing piece of someone else's story. This wasn't about abandonment anymore. It was about connection. The woman, overcome with emotion, asked to see the note. She read it and collapsed into a chair outside the shop, tears falling silently down her cheeks. Her fingers traced the words as though they were touching her son's face. Sophia stood silently, the air thick with reverence. That night, the woman offered Sophia and Benny a place to stay. It wasn't grand, but it had warmth, and the sheets smelled of lavender. Benny curled up beside the old fireplace, his breathing finally steady, and Sophia, for the first time in years, fell asleep without fear. As the rain tapped gently on the window, Sophia understood something profound. She hadn't just saved a dog. She had completed a journey someone else began. She had honored the final wish of a man who had nothing left but the hope that a stranger might care. And in doing so, she had also found the thing she had lost in herself long ago, the belief that she mattered. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither Sophia nor the old woman had expected. Benny, once the weak and fading dog left to die on a bench, began to show signs of unexpected strength. His breathing had stabilized, and while his limbs still trembled from age, there was life in his eyes again, alert, aware, almost grateful. Sophia watched him closely each morning as he rose slowly from his blanket, stretched gently, and ambled toward the light streaming through the window. There was something in the way he moved now that made her believe he had found meaning again, as if the weight of whatever message he had carried all that way had been lifted. It wasn't just recovery, it was peace. Sophia began to understand that he was not just healing from neglect, he was completing a story. The old woman, Agnes, often sat by the fire, her hands folded over her lap, her eyes following Benny's every motion. She never asked more about the note Sophia found. She didn't need to. There was something unspoken between them now, a thread of quiet understanding that bound their lives together more intimately than words could. Sophia spent her evenings writing, not for anyone else, but for herself. She borrowed scraps of paper and old notebooks from Agnes and began recording not only Benny's journey but her own. She wrote about the bench where they met, the smell of rust and dirt in the air that day, the pain she saw in Benny's eyes, and the moment she found the note tucked inside his collar. She wrote about how her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, how her eyes stung when she read the words, how she felt the earth shift under her feet as the meaning settled in her chest. The letter hadn't just been about loss. It had been about love, about hope, about the last effort of a man trying to preserve something good in a world that had taken everything from him. The message had been meant for someone, anyone, who might still care. And somehow, despite the odds, it had reached her. Every time she looked at Benny sleeping soundly near the fire, she felt a responsibility larger than herself. This was no longer about a stray dog. This was about what people leave behind when they can no longer carry it themselves. One afternoon, Sophia returned from a walk through the town square to find Agnes standing in the doorway, her face pale and eyes moist. In her trembling hand was a letter, mailed to the house, addressed to no one in particular. It was from a social worker in another city who had recognized the story Sophia had submitted to a local newsletter. The note in Benny's collar had made it to the internet, shared anonymously by a woman who read it and wept. The social worker believed the man who wrote it had once been her client, an elderly war veteran who had recently passed away, having spent his last days trying to rehome his only companion, Benny. She explained that the man had no family left, no friends he could trust, and no home stable enough to keep a dog alive. So he wrote the letter, attached it to Benny's collar, and spent weeks walking him through different towns, hoping that someone, somewhere, would find him and understand. It had been a desperate plan, but it had worked. The message had traveled, just as he had hoped, and Benny had been found not by accident, but by fate. The revelation deepened the silence in the house but also brought peace. Benny had not been abandoned out of cruelty. He had been entrusted. And Sophia had become the one chosen to carry out what that man could not finish. The layers of the story unfolded gently, Agnes's grief, Sophia's longing, Benny's silent endurance, all tied together by a single moment of grace on that park bench. It was no longer a coincidence. It felt like a plan, even if born from chaos. In the following days, Agnes began to recover pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. She read Sophia's writings, sat beside her as she worked, and even laughed again, a thin, delicate laugh that sounded like something being healed. Benny's presence continued to bridge the gap between what had been lost and what might still be found. He followed Sophia through the garden, dozing in patches of sunlight, occasionally barking at nothing in particular. And every time he looked at her with those tired, trusting eyes, she knew she was not just saving him, he was saving her too. Winter arrived with its biting chill and silver breath, but the house remained warm. Not just from the fireplace, but from something deeper, humanity reborn. Sophia was no longer a shadow. She was part of a story that mattered, and others began to notice. A local teacher offered her part-time work cleaning classrooms. A librarian let her borrow books freely. The children in the neighborhood began greeting her with shy waves. Benny would accompany her on these small walks, limping but proud, his presence like a thread stitching her back into the world. The girl who had once wandered through life invisible was now someone people remembered. Someone who mattered. One evening, as snow flurried outside, Sophia sat beside Benny with a wool blanket wrapped around them both. She whispered thanks, not for what had been given to her, but for what she had been allowed to give. The gift of seeing something broken and refusing to look away. Of choosing to stay when others would have walked past. Then, one morning, as frost clung to the edges of the window, Sophia woke to find Benny still and breathless beside the fire. His eyes were closed, peaceful. There was no pain in his posture, no fear in his limbs. He had passed quietly, wrapped in the warmth of everything he had been denied for so long. Sophia sat beside him for hours, unable to cry at first. Her hand rested on his side, feeling the absence of movement, the silence where a heartbeat used to be. But in that silence, she didn't feel emptiness. She felt completion. Benny had made it home. The man who once tied a message to his collar had been heard. The journey had ended, not in loss, but in love. She buried him beneath the old tree in the garden, wrapped in the same blanket they had shared. Agnes stood beside her, holding her hand. No words were spoken. None were needed. The earth accepted him gently, and the wind carried the memory of his loyalty far beyond the garden walls. Weeks later, a framed photo of Benny sat by the window. Sophia had written their story and sent it to newspapers, to shelters, to anyone who would listen. It wasn't fame she wanted. It was the reminder that sometimes, even when the world discards what it no longer values, there are people willing to stop, to see, to love. And sometimes, dogs like Benny carry the last pieces of broken hearts and stitch them into something whole.